Thank you for letting me do this. Thank you for letting me do this. This week's parsha is Parsha Spay, and really the teeth of the Geula takes place in Parsha Spay and Parsha B'Shalach. We left the Makis, and next week's parsha you're going to have the Kriyas Yamsuf. And one of the most well-known kashas really in the entire Torah is for the bris of Mitzraim, Avram was told that the Galus was supposed to be 400 years, and in reality, Klal Yisrael was in Mitzraim only for 210 years. And the question is, what happened to the missing 190 years? So there are dozens of answers to this kasha, but I saw this year the Sefer Tzviut Tzaddik says something we could all glean instructions from. He says that there's a concept the Gemara tells us, a person has a fear or a worry in his heart, something's bringing him down, he should speak it over with somebody. And of course, there could be psychological reasons why that helps, but he says the pshat is, Me'echatesi, that tzaddik listening to you deserves to suffer. He's going to have great empathy for what you're going through, like Moshe Rabbeinu. And he went out to see what was going on with Klal Yisrael, even though he was raised in the house of Pharaoh. And the tzaddik listening to the tzar that the other person's going through, he should be suffering. So, because of that, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, now it's time to end this gzeira. So, because that's what happened over here. When in Mitzraim, Klal Yisrael was suffering, but each person suffered doubly, because not only did they have tzar, but they were worried about what their chaverim were going through. And because of that, the gzeira was basically cut in half. So the Tzviut Tzaddik says this is the reason why instead of 400 years, it turned into 210. This is something that we can all gain instructions from, even when it comes to dealing with other people. But one of the more well-known answers is that the Gemara tells us that the Schar Nashim Tzidkanias Nigalu. It's the Gemara in Soiti Yadal from Abayz that it was because of the Nashim Tzidkanias of the Dar, Klal Yisrael was redeemed. The Gemara goes through a whole story over there that they would go and because the husbands were extremely exhausted from the toil and the Vaitas Parach, the Nashim had to go and bring about the Pru Revu for Klal Yisrael. And Gemara says because of that, they were not like Shisha B'Karazachat, and Rashi brings this down. So they had 6 children at once. So typically the normal Gezerah of 400 years was meant for a population that was reproducing normally. But over here, since they were having 5 times as many children as they should have been, the male Gezerah really was supposed to be cut into, was able to be cut into a fifth. Because the actual Shibud was 86 years, 86 times 5 is 430. We don't have to get bogged down in the Cheshbainis. But this is the well-known answer. Instead of 400 years, it was able to be done in basically a fifth of the time, so it went to 210. So either way, the Nekuda over here, the Gemara tells us that it was because Nashim Tzidkanias Nigalu. It was because of what the woman did, the Nashim Tzidkanias did in that dar, that Klal Yisrael deserved to be redeemed. And Rashi in Vayakel, Perikam Ches Pasuk Ches, tells us an additional detail. Rashi says that when Moshe Rabbeinu was building when Klal Yisrael was building the Mishkan, a certain amount of maris hatzoyves were donated. The women had donated their mirrors, and Rashi says that Moshe Rabbeinu didn't want to take them. His nusach is with Yetzias li'Yetzahara. The mirrors were used for the Yetzahara. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, you have to accept the mirrors. These were the most precious of everything. Out of anything donated for the Mishkan, the anything, the most precious was the mirrors. Because it was through the mirrors that the women were able to encourage their husbands to still engage in Pru Revu. And so this detail is not in the Gemara, but Rashi quotes it from the Tanchuma. So what happened? Rashi says that the husbands were exhausted, they were in the fields, but the Nashim Tzidkanias would take the maris and they would go, remember, Anina and Chas, they go to be with their husbands, and using the mirrors, they would encourage Pru Revu. Okay, so but HaKadosh Baruch Hu says these mirrors are more chaviv to me than anything else. So just on there, Chagav, there's actually a pleiadic approach in a number of the Rishonim, the Rikanti, the Meshach Kain, B'nei Achraz, I printed up in B'nei Achraz, the easiest one to find. But the question is, okay, so according to Rashi, it sounds like this was a nice thing, right? Hashem said, no, Moshe, you don't want to take these mirrors? No, you have to accept them. They're the most precious to me out of everything. But comes along this whole group of Rishonim and say, no, that's not the pshat is much more than that. The rule is, the way the Bnei Achraz says it is, that a carbon had to be brought l'shma, And in order for it to be brought lishma, you had to look at the person who was bringing the carbon. So, when you have a chuppah, sometimes the Eidim make sure to pick up the veil of the kala to see that they know who's marrying who. So the Panei Achraza says that the pshat over here was the Kaihanim had to see that the woman who's in this, if a woman would bring a carbon, they have to take a look at the woman to make sure that they know who they're bringing the carbon for. But it's also the stop of Neisha, you're not allowed to look at a woman, right? So what did they do? So they had to build the kiyar out of mirrors. They had to have a reflective surface in the Mishkan. The Kayin wouldn't look at the Nashim directly, he would look at the mirror to see the reflection. It's like, oh, now I know who I'm bringing the carbon for. So they needed the mirrors, not, like Rashi makes it sound like it was a nice thing, Mida Keneged Mida. It was most precious of all, but according to this, it was a real halachic necessity. It was actually part of the din l'shma that was necessary for every carbon. So they had to look at the nashim through the mirrors in order to allow the bringing of the carbon. Okay, but that's a side point. But the point I want to focus on from the halachic angle is that Rashi says that the women would make sure to go to their baalim in the basada with these mirrors and look together in the mirror. And it results, according to this, that the men would end up looking at the mirror. And the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, it's in Chavtes, it's really the Mishnah, I think, is on Chav Zayin, but the Gemara in Avodah Zarah talks about a person getting a haircut from a guy. And the truth is, the Gemara says, really, you shouldn't get a haircut from a guy because the guy, you have to worry about the fact that the guy is going to kill the Yisrael. And so the Gemara says, the only time it's mutter, Yisrael Mustaper B'Goy Rei B'Mara. The only time it's mutter to get a haircut from a guy, according to the Shita, is if you're looking in a mirror. If you're looking in a mirror. So the Gemara says, what are we talking about? If you're in a Rishus Rabbim, so why is the mirror necessary? If you're in a Rishus Yachid, why does the mirror help? So the Gemara says, no, really we're dealing in a case of Rishus Yachid. Rishus Yachid, it's a private domain. But the reason why the mirror helps is it's a way, it's a chetimsa for you to look like an Adam Chashuv, and the guy's not going to mess with an Adam Chashuv. He's not going to try to kill a Yisrael who's somebody who's very who has significance, who has maybe connections. That's the mashmalis of the Gemara. So the mirror is not really anything ba'atzim. It's just there as a way to display the guy's prominence. So Tosfos says from here it sounds like looking in a mirror is asur for a man. And he has a raya. He quotes a Tosefta that there was a special heter that was given to the house of Rabbi Gamliel to look in a mirror because they were so always dealing with the malchus. With the ruling authorities of the time, so they had to look appropriate and put together. So the Chazal said, okay, the house of Rabbi Gamliel can look in a mirror, but anybody else, Tosfos says it sounds like any other man would not be allowed to look in the mirror. And Tosfos says the nira, it seems to be the reason is a man is not supposed to wear articles of clothing that are feminine. And interestingly enough, Tosfos feels that the emes is the pasuk says you shouldn't wear a man shouldn't wear women's clothing. So what's the pshat that we're able to incorporate into that to looking into a mirror? So Tosfos quotes the Targum: any action that's an action of fixing up to be something that's feminine is included in the prohibition. It's a few times that the Targum Onkelos does this. He takes the pasuk a little bit out of the pashtus and creates really important halachic ramifications. So Tosfos uses the Targum to say that according to this, it sounds to him this is the reason why it's also for a man to look in the mirror, and the one time it's allowed for a man was because he had to have dealings with the malchus. And yeah, so this is Tosfos' conclusion. According to Tosfos, it's really also for a man to look in the mirror, except at the end, Tosfos, because there are other rights we're not going to get into, but Tosfos says, it's only if you're doing it to beautify yourself that we could call it Le'il Bashkever Simlas Isha. I will stop it, but if a person's doing it for practical reasons, so that he doesn't get hurt, or maybe he has to put on some type of eye potion. In these cases, it would be okay. Right? So Tosfos says the Yesnayis is the problem. Only if a person's doing it to be the Yesnayis to Isha. Then you're going to have an issue of Le'il Bashkever Simlas Isha. So, okay, so back to our kasha, that what right did the men in Mitzraim have to look in the mirror? You could say they weren't really doing it Yesnayis. I mean, Rashi's nusach is that the woman would say, Ani no'em imcha. But to say that the men were doing this noise, it could be a very simple way out. And this would say the mice al derech, a little bit al derech pilpul. It could be that this is the reason why Moshe Rabbeinu didn't want to accept the mirrors. Okay, the kashas, the Rishonim is kashas and Rashi because Moshe was willing to accept the kumas, but the mirror he had a problem with. So Okay, maybe we shouldn't try to figure it out, but maybe we could say the reason is because Moshe Rabbeinu didn't like that the man used the mirrors. Okay, I ain't sure. But as far as why it was mutter, maybe we could say that according to Taisus, it was only if it's only less nice over here, it wasn't less nice, and therefore there was no problem. L'maisa, the Shulchan Aruch in Kuf Nun Vav, the Ramah, the Shulchan Aruch brings down the Ran. It's a different approach, and the Ran says that looking in a mirror is okay, but it depends on the minhag hamakam. A totally different approach. So according to Taisus, it depends on if you're doing this nice. According to the Ran, it depends on what is the minhag hamakam. In order for something to be considered simlas isha, it's going to depend on what the minhag of the locale that you're talking about is. If it's in a place where the men also look in the mirrors, then it would be okay. And so it was bothering me, according to this, and what was going on in Mitzraim. So I want to say a little bit of derech pilpul, a little bit of derech drush, but it ends up, I think you kind of end up seeing that there's a taikif to it. If you look, the Gemara in Seita says, and that the Mitzraim worked Klal Yisrael b'farach, with a crushing labor. So what does it mean b'farach? So the Gemara has a few approaches, parach and so on, but the approach that seems like everybody agrees with, they would switch the tasks that were supposed to be for men were given to the women, and the tasks that were supposed to be for women were given to the men. Right? So this was the avodas parach. The back-breaking labor was that the men were stuck doing what the women were supposed to do, and the women were tasked with what the men were supposed to do. So I wanted to say, if this is the case, now we can understand, even according to the Ran, why the men were able to look in the mirror. Because the minhag hamakam was totally flipped around. It was menahabachu mamish, right? So in as much as in Mitzrayim, the men were doing what the women do, so maybe looking in the mirror should have been okay, even according to the Ran. Okay, it sounds a little bit of derech pilpul, it sounds a little bit of derech drush, but if you look, the Ramah in Orach Chaim Tafresh Tzadi Vav brings a bizarre minhag that I asked, someone tell me to come today. Nobody really knows why this was the minhag. The Ramah says it's okay, but why this was the minhag, this ain't the husband. So the Ramah says that it's mutter to, or people would wear masks on Purim, and a gaver would be leidesh simas isha, and an isha kli gaver. So Klal Yisrael was lying, apparently, this is for at least 1,000 years. He's bringing this from the Mitzraim. So Klal Yisrael was lying that on Purim the men would dress up like women, and women would dress up like men. So all the poskim do not like this. Bishop Ruh, take a look, but nobody explains why this was a thing. What was this a minute for? So dressing up, there's all sorts of Torah about, right? Why dress up that a man should look like a woman? Where does this come from? So there's Mikhail Alakavi. The simplest way to say this is the reason for the Geula from Mitzrayim was Chinuch brings this down in Mitzvah Sphere. But so except the Torah. It was Kabbalah Torah. Now we know Kabbalah Torah wasn't Nishlan, because it was Kafalei and Harkigis, like the Gemara in Shabbos says. So the real kiyum of Kabbalah Torah would only take place during the time of the Geula from Achashverosh. That's when there was a real Kabbalah Torah. And so Kamat is said in many svarim, it's not my chiddush, it's said in many places. But the true Geula from Mitzrayim, the real Kabbalah Torah, would only take place when Klal Yisrael would accept the Torah again, there'd be Me'ach Hashverish. So I wanted to say maybe that's the shot in the minhag to not be concerned with Layilvash. So what turns out over here? The avodas parach gufa was that the men had to do what the women did, and the women had to do what the men did. So if that was the avodas parach, when we're coming to Purim, which is the geula from the taikif of that galus, right? The true geula is going to happen. The true redemption is going to take place through the Kabbalah Torah of Purim, which is coming up. We're almost maybe that could be the reason why Klal Yisrael decided to take on this minhag to show that the Leisilbash was the avodas parach, and now we're taka being nigal. There's a few much deeper ways to say this, but that's the Rashi Prakim. Lamaisa, I just wanted to say, I wanted to ask what I said before, but it would seem to me that if there's a shaila by mirrors, and we have to come on to maybe it's minhag hamakim, maybe that's why people are allowed to look at mirrors, or maybe it's because it's not l'snais, but something that's clearly l'snais and not really minhag hamakim, at least in my opinion, probably should be usher. So one of the things we spoke about in Kol Baker when we did the Taisus was maybe wearing cologne, something like that, should be a problem because it's definitely less nice. And to say that minhag hamakom is to wear cologne, that's not the case yet. So ask your basic, but it would seem to me that there's room to say that is a reason. That's a place to be machmir from this from the halachic angle of this conversation. Huh?
I mean, Bisman is that meant like to be this nice. It's not just a feminine thing.
So you're at least running into Taisus then, right? Because at least according to Taisus, that would be a problem.
Only because that was anti-masculine behavior. Nowadays, perhaps it's not an anti-masculine behavior. So
I mean, Taisus, that you're merging the Taisus and the Ran then by doing that. Taisus himself says it depends if it's darker, it's nice or not. If you're looking in the mirror, it's nice. So to say that because the minhag hamakom is to not care about the Yobash anymore, Taisus would have would have issues with that. Maybe you could say that in the Ran. Maybe, even though I would argue with that also. But okay, Yashakeh, thank you. So, the Purim was coming up. So I thought it would be, but it's not Purim.